The U.S.-Nigeria relationship covers a wide range of important issues and strategic interests. The juxtaposition of democracy and a market economy, pushed by the United States for a long time, seems to be under enormous stress in the context of the global economic crisis, especially the Russia-Ukraine war. Thus, it evokes the ideas of synergy, state capacity, and the role of the U.S. in helping economies like Nigeria to consolidate and remain strong, while ensuring that politics is democratically achieved amid human development. Joining us now to discuss his 3-year tour of duty in Nigeria and the United States socio-political and economic activities as they relate to the most populous African country is Will Stevens, United States Consul General at the U.S Consul General in Lagos. Mr. Stevens is an experienced foreign service officer with overseas experience in South Africa, Russia, Turkmenistan, Israel, and Belarus, as well as experience in Washington at the Foreign Service Institute, the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, and the Bureau of African Affairs. Welcome to the Morning Show.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. Well, 3 years so far in Nigeria.
Just arrived 3 months ago. Going to be here for 3 years.
You've been?
I just got here.
You just got here?
In August, yeah.
3 months ago?
Yep.
Oh, okay. So where did...
This is my You Are Welcome moment to Arise TV.
But what are the priorities this time?
Of course. So I'm really here, and at the consulate, we're primarily focused on working on those 3 pillars of our relationship, which is about increasing trade and investment between our 2 countries, working together to promote democracy and health and security, and then obviously working on security. And it differs obviously from what the embassy is doing in the security realm, where they're focusing primarily on the north and in security, whereas we focus on the maritime issues and the ports and working with the issues down here in concert with our colleagues in Abuja. So.
Brilliant. So welcome, Ekabo, and the other languages. So in terms of your priorities, I know you've highlighted the 3, but what are you're coming in at a very strategic time in the nation's lifetime, in terms of we have an election cycle, a very important one, by the way, in 2023. What would be your priority in the next few months leading up to the elections?
Yeah. Well, obviously, we're very focused on the elections and working together with our partners to support Nigeria's efforts to have a free, fair, and credible election that represents the will of the Nigerian people. And that includes, over the last few years, a lot of support to organizations like INEC to ensure that when you do vote, your vote will be counted. And that also involves engaging with the candidates. We hosted the top four vice presidential candidates at my residence on Friday as they engage with American businesses to talk about the economic issues facing Nigeria. 3 of the 4 candidates have been to Washington, D.C. to talk with officials at the White House and the State Department to talk about how the U.S. can partner. And really, it's about partnership, right? It's working together to deal with the issues that face the entire world.
And these issues are quite enormous. You know, we've got issues around the synergy of trade, poverty, insecurity, and all of that. Does this segue into the conversation around when President Joe Biden gets to meet African leaders, and what will he be saying in those conversations?
Absolutely. It dovetails perfectly with what President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and others are doing next week in Washington, D.C., where we'll be hosting the Africa Leaders Summit. President Biden has invited 49 African leaders to come to Washington for a 3-day conference to work with everything from discussions with youth, civil society, the creative industries, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA forum will be held, a full-day summit on business forum, the Africa Business Forum, and then engagement with leadership and leaders. And there'll be a state dinner at the White House hosted by President Biden and Vice President Harris. So those are really focused on our Africa strategy, which has shifted a little bit over the years. The U.S. has been engaged in Africa for a long time, and we used to talk about African solutions to African problems. And anyone who's heard me speak has heard me say this. What we're really talking about today is working together to find African solutions to global problems. And that is about partnership, because the problems that face us aren't African problems or U.S. problems. Climate change, the threats to democracy, Russia's horrible invasion of Ukraine, those are problems that impact all of us, and we need to work together to combat the impacts of them, and work together to foster the solutions that I know Nigerians have.
Okay, yes. I mean, the summit, this is the second one, right?
Yeah.
The African-U.S. Summit. But what are the challenges in your view? Because if you look at some of those issues that will be discussed, climate change, infrastructure investments, and all of that, what do you think are the possible challenges? And now we have many of these Africa Plus One, summits. France interested in Africa, Japan interested in Africa, China interested in Africa. So when you say there is a shift in terms of focus on Africa, is this as a result of other parts of the world, other superpowers, seeing Africa as a next frontier?
Well, and when I talk about shift, I think it's talking about how we discuss our partnership, right? It's about working together, because Secretary Blinken, when he first came into office, and President Biden said, we need to rebuild our partnerships. We need to work together. We cannot do it alone. The United States can't do it alone. Western countries can't do it alone. We all need to work together. So this is about listening to each other, coming together to discuss the challenges we face. And that event that I mentioned on Friday night is a great example. Listening to U.S. companies talk to your candidates about what are the issues facing Nigeria? Why are they holding back on investment, or where do they see potential for future engagement? So it's about talking to one another and then working together to find those solutions. And if the solutions come from Nigeria, then supporting those solutions and bringing them to the global stage. I think that's a recipe for success. And I think the reason you have this increased focus, there's a lot of reason for it, right? Nigeria is going to be the third largest country in the world by 2050. We have to get it right. We collectively have to get it right. We have to, and if you're a U.S. company that wants to be involved in the African continent, you need to get into Nigeria, and you need to work well here, understand the market, find the right investments, find the right partners, and bring those goods and items to the market here, but bring the things that are being created here out to the world.
Right. Next week at the summit, you would also be meeting, beyond just meeting with African leaders, you'd also be meeting with African business leaders. And what you have mentioned in the past is that we haven't taken advantage of the African Growth Opportunity Act. What opportunities aren't, or how are we not taking advantage of that? And how can Nigeria in particular take advantage of the opportunities that Act provides?
AGOA, the African Growth
Yes.
Opportunities Act, is an incredible opportunity for African nations and businesses to export duty-free to the United States. This stems back from the 1990s when we used to talk about trade, not aid. Remember that old buzz phrase? And the idea is you can produce here and ship to the US duty-free, which gives you an incredible leg up into the market. And I came here from South Africa. Over the last 3 years I was in South Africa, where they've really figured out how to use AGOA to their advantage. And you have everyone from people in the fashion industry to people making engines, high quality jewelry, to even citrus being exported to the United States duty-free, being sold on platforms as diverse as Amazon, to major US grocers, to huge stores like Neiman Marcus and Saks Fifth Avenue showcasing those goods. And Nigeria could do the exact same thing. And those exporters need to just figure out how to market to the US and then leverage AGOA. And we're working on that. So we have a training program for, it's called the Academy of Women Entrepreneurs, that's run at our American centers around the country. You probably have met some of these great entrepreneurs. Yes, and helping them understand, well, is there a market for your goods, and how would you reach that market? And what are some of the barriers to doing that? How do you get, if you're only shipping a small container worth of things, how can you consolidate your containers with others? Basic things that would help exporters figure out how to use AGOA.
I mean, that's exciting, although a lot of people will make the argument with you that Nigeria has not done a lot, to be able to use the AGOA quota as regards churning out products, maybe because that knowledge gap is lacking as regards trade and all of that, and prior investment. But also, all of this talk about trade will not be possible without the talk about insecurity. So I don't know at this conference what you'll be discussing, but probably the talk about Russia being in town. And I mean being in town means being on the African continent. I mean, we've seen incursions coming as close as Mali and the likes now, with the French, stopping the Operation Barkhane, and the Russians taking over most of this, exit points and things like that. I mean, vis-a-vis the war going on in Russia and Ukraine, what does that portend?
Yeah, obviously we'll continue to talk about security. Security in the Sahel, countering violent extremism, working together here in Nigeria. But you raise a really good point. Russia is not a country that foments security and peace. If you look at its neighbors, their neighbors do not look to Russia as a partner for security and stability. A country that is ignoring and violating the foundational rules of the international order. You do not go into a sovereign nation and try to annex territory. It's a rule that we all established when we formed the United Nations. It's an underlying tenet of international order, and the fact that Russia thinks they can do this is incredibly upsetting, and I think it threatens democracy and it threatens kind of peace and security around the world because it sets a precedent that we believe cannot be tolerated, and which is why we've worked across the world to kind of build a coalition at the United Nations to reject Russia's attempts at annexation, to reject Russia's violent and brutal invasion of Ukraine.
Well, Mr. Stevens, could you speak to the fact that the U.S. is inviting only 49 African leaders, whereas we have 54? So almost deliberately, the U.S. government is excluding 5 countries. Why? And Eritrea is one of them, right? Guinea-Conakry, right? Burkina Faso, Somaliland, but why?
So there's actually a unifying element that is quite easy for you to recognize. Those countries with which we have diplomatic relations were invited, so we don't have relations with Eritrea. But those other 4 countries you mentioned are not in good standing with the African Union. So we deferred to our African Union partners, and the African Union will actually be there at the summit and didn't invite countries that aren't in good standing with the AU in deference to our AU colleagues, where they've been experiencing coups and the AU has had issues with them.
Right, recently, a report highlighted food security in Nigeria, and as part of the conversations at the summit next week, you would be discussing initiatives around food security, not just in Nigeria, of course, but across Africa. Mm-hmm. Could you highlight some of the initiatives that the U.S.
Sure, of
has?
Course. So we've been working closely around the world with producers and transshippers because Russia's invasion has certainly impacted global food supply, as complicated by the COVID epidemic that hit shipping lines. And here in Nigeria, what you'll see is organizations like USAID working on programs like Feed the Future, where we're trying to improve both supply chains, but also production lines, and providing expertise. So I know I've seen a variety of Nigerian farmers come through our consulate to get visas to go on exchanges to the United States to learn about cashew production, or looking at bringing in potential different stocks of chickens from the United States to increase production here in Nigeria. And then we're big advocates of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. We think that there's a lot of opportunity there, and that could be a really great opportunity for Nigeria to play a major role in agriculture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, just to segue and piggyback on the point Dr. Abati raised, Russia still comes into the conversation because part of those countries that you're not calling for this conference, I'll pick out one, Guinea. And Guinea, we all know why it is Guinea. Apart from the African Union slant, it's the fact that Mbabaye has direct ties with the Kremlin. And this is on the same African continent. And there's been sightings of the Wagner Group on the African continent. And you know the history of Prigozhin, Wagner, and his closeness to Putin and all of that. And now they are holding their foot on the African continent. And especially when France did decide to leave with his Operation Barkhane, the Russians are taking and filling all those parts across the Sahel. And the agreement that used to be called the G5 is no longer there.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, the question is, how does this, affect the outlay of things, vis-a-vis this conference you're having?
Yeah, well, and again, we deferred to the African Union on this, and they're not in good standing for reasons, right? And those reasons, I think, are both coups, but how they're conducting themselves with other African nations and themselves. And obviously, the Wagner Group has a terribly troubling record of human rights violations across the continent and in other conflict zones. And it's something that we're acutely aware of and monitor quite closely. But I think if you look at the summit more broadly, it's really a summit about looking forward and looking at how we can build security architecture, but also economic architecture. One thing I always try to do is try to be positive when I talk about the continent, because I'm an Afro-optimist. I believe that the second half of the 21st century is the African century, and that we need to, as the United States, continue to position ourselves to be a part of that. I believe that this continent and this nation in particular, Nigeria, will be playing a massive role on the world stage That's why I begged to come here to Lagos, to be in this job, because I think the opportunities to position the relationship. I also believe the U.S. is the partner of choice for Nigeria. When I look in the eyes of Nigerians, they're excited to team with the United States, to go to the United States. They want to, and maybe they're just being friendly because Nigerians are so friendly, but I truly think that we look to one another as partners. And I think the United States does the same thing with Nigeria. So many American companies have come to me and talked to us about working here and what can we do and how do we get involved in this market. So I know that wasn't your question, but I need to, it's so easy to be negative, and there's so many good reasons for the long term to be positive, and we should focus on those too.
Okay, I'm going to rephrase that.
I'm sure.
And put it like this. The U.S. lost considerable ground in Africa. And within that interval, China moved in. China is all over the place. Is this part of the competition with China? The America's renewed interest in Africa. That's how I will phrase it. Because the competition, technology, people, all over from Switzerland to everywhere. Only yesterday, the Department of Commerce blacklisted over 40 companies, that may be doing business either with Russia or Pakistan or China. Anyway, but beyond government-to-government relations, where is the people element in this proposed U.S. Africa summit? Like young people, I know you mentioned business people, but there's also the cultural dimension.
So I would challenge your tenant, first of all, that the U.S. has lost ground, because I think there's a couple of things that often get forgotten, right? The U.S. model is a different model.
Okay.
We focus on private investment. We focus on our very robust private sector. So when we come to the table, unfortunately, I can't say, here's my 5 companies that are going to do these 7 things for you, Nigeria. That's not the way it works. But if you look at the continent last year, there was $7.3 billion of private foreign direct investment that came to the continent. $5.5 billion came from the United States. If you look at the 9 unicorns in the tech sector on the African continent, first of all, 5 are here in Lagos. Yeah. All of them are incorporated in the United States, and almost all of their funding comes from the United States. Yeah. If you look at who's the largest provider of humanitarian assistance on the continent, it's the United States of America. And it has been for decades and decades. If you look at the work that we've done in the health sector, right? The U.S. is engaged in supporting people and health, and the things that we're doing aren't often bright, shiny objects, right? But we are keeping people alive, right? 1.7 million Nigerians are alive on ARTs because of the PEPFAR program and the work that we've done together in Nigeria to combat HIV/AIDS. So I think, obviously, there's a lot of people that are interested in the continent for those reasons I laid out, right? There's a lot of really great stuff happening, and anybody with a brain wants to be part of this African kind of evolution and engagement. That makes sense. But I wouldn't agree that there's been any ground lost. I think there's more players in the arena, and that's great, because that means good things for Africa, right? That means more investment, that means more capital. But you asked a much softer question than that, which I'll answer.
I asked about
people. About people, and
events on the sidelines.
Absolutely, and there's a whole plethora of them. I wish I had a list of them. I don't, because there's so many organizations that are doing it, and I can't tell you how many invitations I've gotten to participate. I wish I were going to be there next week. But organizations as diverse as the Atlantic Council, the Corporate Council on Africa, bringing in doing topics as things like the creative sectors, where I know that several Nigerians will be talking and speaking about investment in the creative sector and how music and film and video gaming and sports and arts and fashion are leading the way. And obviously Nigeria is a huge player in that arena, if not the kind of beating cultural heart of the continent.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm glad we are touching on youth and the creative sector, in addition to business, which you'll be focusing as well on next year. Now, in your work in South Africa, you expanded trade and investment relations between South Africa and the US by 50%. And so I'd be interested to know what your trade or your investment, the sectors you're looking to invest in Nigeria beyond the business. So you talked about youth. I know that the US is, like you mentioned, with women, with young people, in the creative sector. What other areas are you looking to expand investment, US and Nigeria?
Absolutely. We're really focused in on the tech sector, because I think there's an incredible opportunity there. We are focused on agriculture. We're actually focused on the private healthcare sector. I just had a meeting yesterday with the Development Finance Corporation, where they're providing loan guarantees to several banks here in Nigeria to provide small investments in the private health sector, in the food production, agriculture sector, where we think there's tremendous opportunity, untapped potential. And so part of that is assistance and aid. So it's USAID giving money to the Development Finance Corporation to provide these loan guarantees to banks. It's one of those things, like I said, it's not always easy to know what the United States is doing because we don't come in with a giant brand USA on we don't slap a sticker on every box or every investment. The second aspect of that is how do you increase trade and investment? I think helping Nigerians understand the opportunities under AGOA is a huge opportunity. Helping them recognize that you can get your goods to the U.S. market. There is a demand. And where I see tremendous opportunity for that is in the Nigerian diaspora in the United States. The Nigerian diaspora is the most successful diaspora in the United States when it comes to education and income levels. Which means they come back and they want to be here and they want to be home invested in this market. They may live in the United States, they may have homes here as well. And so many of the companies that are building and investing from the United States are led by or engaged with Nigerian members of the diaspora in the US. So I think those two offer opportunities right away. Tech, agriculture, private health sector, and the diaspora engaging in AGOA exports because they know what the goods are, they know who the great producers are.
I mean, you said something recently I was taken aback. You said the big brown USA will not slap its presence on anything, but the question is, wouldn't you rather do that? Because when you look at it, you talked about the investment in Africa. In Nigeria, the two major tech deals we've had, with Main One and the likes are US companies. I mean, Equinox and all of that, and Stripe, we can't move away from that. But also a top American media owner and publisher once said something profound, Round of Hearst. He said, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. So isn't it time for Americans to be able to show the things they're doing on the African continent, hence to be able to tackle narratives like they're losing ground, because that's why a lot of people are saying America's actually losing ground, and that's the narrative everywhere out there.
Will you even help me?
You're on TV now. Do it. Do it.
I mean, I do it all the time, right?
You're on TV.
We're constantly talking about the U.S. role, right, and how the U.S. is engaged, and what's happening, and it can be a small thing. From here's a great woman leader who started a company, and she went through our Academy of Women Entrepreneurs, and then she got a grant from the U.S. Africa Development Foundation for $50,000 to grow and innovate her company. And then after that, it leads to another funding with tech companies where they invest in her company. And so there's this sort of timeline continuum, and I think it's there. I mean, we see it in the demand for visas. We see it in the demand for students. You had last year a 12% increase in the number of Nigerians studying in the United States, almost 15,000 Nigerians, which puts Nigeria in the top 10 countries sending to the United States. I think that's a great thing. I know we talk about JAPA, but let me tell you, when they go, they come back. And they study and they learn, and when they come back, they bring back...
All of them come back?
Not all of them, of course not. But many do, and they come back, like Main One, perfect example. Funke studied in the US, worked in the US for 15 years, came back and founded that company, built tremendous value, and then leveraged her connections and reputation to get investment from the US. It happens every day. These connections, these foundational kind of people-to-people ties are what built that relationship, the relationship that I think we all enjoy between the United States and Nigeria, and the one we are committed to keeping strong as we go into the next century.
All right.
Before we go,
I thought I was going to get to end on that.
We can't meet with the Consul General of the U.S. and not discuss visas.
Of course not.
Because, many Nigerians listening to you will be interested in that, particularly for students. Recently, the U.S. Embassy said, look, students who want to renew their visas, they don't have to come for interviews. And that, they will get it. Is that a guarantee now that more Nigerian students can just go to the U.S. for study?
So we are definitely prioritizing getting students their interviews. We did it in the summer so that they could get to school by September, and we're doing it now so they can get to school in January. The second thing we've done is the formerly known as Dropbox, which is the interview waiver program. If you have had a visa in the last 4 years that has expired in the last 4 years, you can mail in your application. That means you don't need to come for an appointment. You can mail in your application and you can get your visa reviewed that way. So that's an expansion. It used to be 2 years, now it's 4 years. We just announced that last week. We think that's going to put a tremendous dent in the sort of backlog of demand because it's a lot faster for us to process those interview waivers. You're not required to come in for an interview. Not just students, but tourist travel visas, you can mail them in. We've also dramatically increased the number of people working at the consulate in the consular section so that we have more people there to offer interviews and to support American citizens, of which there are many here in Nigeria, and help them get their birth certificates for their children, American citizens, get their passports renewed. It's something that we're absolutely focused on, and I know it's an issue that comes up in every single conversation I have, which I think is a part of the demand for the partnership, right? If people didn't want to engage with the U.S., they wouldn't be asking me about visas.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Stevens, for joining us. We wish you all the best.